They called it Nexus 9, the Great Filter. Every species that landed there vanished. Then came the humans. We watched from orbit, expecting to document their extinction like all the others. Instead, we saw something that defied centuries of galactic doctrine. A human xenobiologist was calmly feeding apex predators like they were house pets. This isn't just survival. It's something far more dangerous and revolutionary. The view screen showed Nexus 9, a world that had consumed every advanced species that dared land. We watched that swirling cauldron of lethal biology from orbit, our instruments reading atmospheric toxins at concentrations that would dissolve most known life forms within minutes. The planet's surface moved with predatory life forms that registered as thermal blooms on our scopes, each one a potential extinction event for any unprepared visitor. Our archives held records of 17 separate civilizations that had attempted to colonize that nightmare landscape. Not one had lasted a full week. Each failure followed the same pattern. Initial scans would show promising mineral deposits or ideal atmospheric conditions. Landing parties would establish perimeter defenses. Then the planet would react. Not with coordinated intelligence, but with sheer biological aggression. Flora that released neurotoxins upon touch. Fauna that could chew through reinforced alloys. Microorganisms that bypassed every known filtration system. The last transmission from the Cathar expedition showed their command center being overrun by what appeared to be mobile fungal growth. Their final words were a chemical analysis of the spores eating through their environment suits. Our initial scans detected human biosignatures, 3 months strong. The reading was so improbable that we ran 5 separate diagnostic checks on our sensors. The probability of mammalian survival past 72 hours was calculated at 0.04%. Yet there they were, their life signs steady and consistent across multiple readings. They had established a settlement they called Horizon, though from our perspective it looked more like a collection of temporary shelters than a proper colony. We cataloged their primitive structures, their lack of energy shielding, their apparent vulnerability. Their primary construction material appeared to be processed local timber, reinforced with woven fiber composites. They used chemical combustion for heating and cooking, creating visible smoke plumes that should have attracted every predator within 50 kilometers. Their perimeter defense consisted of simple motion sensors and physical barriers that wouldn't stop a determined Nexian predator for more than a few seconds. The doctrine was clear. Deathworlds are quarantined. They are filters.
They are not conquered.
5 centuries of interstellar exploration had taught us that some environments simply cannot be tamed. The loss of 17 civilizations had established protocols that every species in the Galactic Council followed without question. Yet the humans moved through the toxic foliage with a casual disregard for established safety procedures. They handled unknown plant life with bare hands. They collected water from streams that our sensors showed teeming with parasitic life. Their survival wasn't just statistically improbable. It was an insult to centuries of cautious interstellar policy. Every rule we had developed through tragic experience they seemed to break deliberately. Where we would deploy full environmental suits, they wore simple cloth garments. Where we would use remote drones for exploration, they walked the terrain themselves. Where we would establish multiple redundant defense systems, they appeared to rely on observation and adaptation. We adjusted our sensors for maximum resolution, expecting to document their impending extinction. The patterns were too established, the statistics too overwhelming. No species could survive that environment without the technological advantages that previous civilizations had possessed and found inadequate. Our instruments focused on their settlement, waiting for the inevitable crisis that would end this anomaly. The readings showed something entirely unexpected. Their biosignatures weren't just surviving. They were thriving. Metabolic rates indicated improved health markers. Their settlement showed signs of expansion rather than contraction. They had established gardening plots in soil that our analysis showed was saturated with heavy metals. They had even constructed what appeared to be observation blinds near known predator nesting sites. We weren't prepared for what we saw next. One of their biologists was approaching a fully grown Nexian striped hunter, the most lethal land predator on the planet. The creature's claws could shred durasteel. Its venom could drop a fully grown Raxian warrior in 3 heartbeats. The human carried no visible weapons. She held out what appeared to be a container of food. Our sensors detected elevated pheromone levels from the predator, but not aggression markers. Curiosity, tolerance. The human was speaking to it. Torque ordered a full-spectrum analysis, his mandibles clicking with disapproval as he muttered about contamination protocols and standard observation distances. The order came with that particular edge in his voice that meant he wasn't asking for opinions. He wanted data, cold, hard numbers that would either explain this anomaly or confirm it was about to end tragically. Our sensors shifted to maximum resolution, every frequency and spectrum scanning that settlement below. The team, Gleeks, Zarn, Kra, began their work with sterile skepticism, recording every nanosecond of human activity as if documenting a pathology report. Their talons moved across consoles with practiced efficiency, isolating biological readings, atmospheric samples, and behavioral patterns. This wasn't curiosity. This was an autopsy in progress. Their initial assessment compiled exactly what we expected to find. A list of human deficiencies that should have meant their immediate extinction. Inferior physical strength compared to most galactic species. No natural armor or defensive biological adaptations. A painfully slow reproductive cycle that offered no rapid recovery from population losses. Their technology was laughable by council standards. Chemical propulsion, primitive alloy construction, energy systems that relied on combustion and simple solar collection. We watched them expand their outpost, Horizon, adding structures that looked like they might blow over in the first major storm. The entire settlement had the temporary quality of a research camp, not a permanent colony. It was flimsy. It should not have worked. Their behavior patterns were coded as reckless across every metric. They wandered beyond their established perimeter without environmental suits. They touched unknown flora with bare hands. They collected water samples from streams teeming with microbial life that our databases identified as lethal to 90% of known species. Gleeks noted their curiosity as a primitive survival trait, a form of biological bravado that would inevitably lead to their end. He compared it to juvenile exploration behavior in developing species that hadn't yet learned danger assessment. Zarn argued their persistence suggested some unknown biological adaptation, perhaps a heightened pain tolerance or rapid cellular regeneration that wasn't showing on our scans. The data streams refused to coalesce into a clean, logical explanation. Temperature readings showed they slept in exposed shelters during nighttime periods when predator activity peaked. Audio feeds captured what sounded like laughter during high-risk activities. They were not following the rules. The rules said they should be dead. Their entire operational methodology contradicted 5 centuries of established galactic safety protocols. Where we would deploy drones, they sent people. Where we would build reinforced bunkers, they used local materials. Where we would avoid contact with unknown life forms, they approached them with what appeared to be genuine interest. Our entire framework for assessing Deathworld viability was being challenged by beings who treated extreme danger like an interesting puzzle to be solved rather than a threat to be neutralized. The tension on the bridge grew with each passing hour they remained alive. This wasn't supposed to happen. The statistics were too clear, the historical precedents too established. Then the feed from the northern clearing activated. The cameras focused on a human female standing near a known predator den site. She held no weapons. She made no defensive postures. She was simply standing there, watching as 2 striped hunter cubs emerged from the undergrowth and began playing near her feet. The adult predator watched from a distance, its posture relaxed, its lethal claws retracted. The human reached into a container and offered food to the cubs. They took it from her hand without aggression. Our sensors showed no stress hormones in her system. Her heart rate remained steady. She was speaking to them in a calm, conversational tone. The real disbelief began when she reached out and actually touched one of the cubs, her fingers gently moving through its fur as it ate from her palm. The predator that should have torn her limb from limb simply watched, its head tilted in what our behavior algorithms identified as curiosity. This wasn't survival through superior technology or biological adaptation. This was something else entirely. Something that didn't appear in any of our databases or tactical manuals. Gleeks stopped his analysis mid-sentence. Zarn's mandibles went completely still. Torque leaned forward, his 4 eyes narrowing as he watched the impossible unfold on the view screen. The view screen showed a human female, designation Maya Patel, standing in a sun-dappled clearing as if waiting for a scheduled appointment rather than facing certain death. Her biosignature registered calm, heart rate steady at 68 beats per minute. Respiration patterns indicated normal oxygen exchange. None of the physiological markers associated with fight or flight response. No adrenaline spikes, no cortisol elevation. Her posture remained relaxed, weight distributed evenly, hands visible and open. She might have been standing in a city park back on Earth, rather than the most lethal environment the galaxy had ever catalogued. Approaching her from the tree line was a fully grown Nexian striped hunter, an apex predator that had ended 3 of the 17 previous colonization attempts. Its shoulder muscles rippled under patterned fur that served as natural camouflage. Each paw contained retractable claws that could shred durasteel plating. Its jaw could exert pressure sufficient to crush military-grade alloys. Our sensors detected its body heat signature, the elevated metabolism of a hunter on the move. It moved with that particular silent grace that only comes from being the undisputed master of your environment. Every movement spoke of evolutionary perfection in the art of killing. She did not raise a weapon. She did not assume a defensive stance. She simply held out a transparent container filled with what appeared to be strips of preserved meat. She was offering it food, not as a diversion or distraction, but as an offering. The predator's head tilted, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent. It paused 3 meters from her, massive body coiled with potential energy that could launch it across that distance in less than a second. Our impact probability calculations gave her survival chances at 0 if it decided to attack. She spoke to it. "Hello, beautiful," she said, her voice clear through our enhanced audio pickups. "Where are your babies today? Did you leave them in the den?" The words were conversational, almost affectionate, as if greeting a neighbor's pet rather than addressing a creature that had literally eaten the last survey team we'd sent to this sector. The predator took another step forward, then another, its movement cautious but not aggressive. It sniffed the container, then carefully took a piece of meat from her outstretched hand. Its teeth came within centimeters of her fingers, but made no contact with her skin. Tolerance, not hostility, defined the interaction. Our behavioral analysis algorithms flagged the predator's body language as curious rather than predatory. Ear positions indicated alert interest rather than aggression. Tail movement suggested assessment rather than hunting preparation. Then 4 cubs emerged from the undergrowth, their smaller versions of the same lethal biology tumbling over each other in that clumsy playfulness of youth. They immediately surrounded her legs, rubbing against her like domestic animals seeking attention. She scolded them with actual affection in her tone. "Careful with those claws," she joked, gently moving one persistent cub away from her leg with a carefully placed foot. "You know better than to scratch the food source." She spoke to them as if they were colleagues rather than creatures designed by evolution to kill her species. One cub tried to climb her leg using claws that could have easily torn through her flesh. She disentangled it with practiced ease, her movements fluid and unafraid. This defied all evolutionary logic. The observers on the bridge whispered the phrase like a mantra, as if repeating it might make the impossible comprehensible. It was impossible. Predator-prey relationships don't rewrite themselves based on conversational tone. Evolutionary advantages don't surrender to simple courtesy. 500 years of xenobiological study insisted this couldn't happen, yet our sensors showed it happening in real time, with biological readings that contradicted every established model of interspecies interaction. This wasn't survival through superior technology or physical force. It wasn't about stronger shields or better weapons. It was something else entirely, something our databases had no category for. She continued speaking to the creatures, her tone shifting as she apparently recognized individual cubs, calling one the adventurous one and another your careful sister. The adult predator watched with what our systems reluctantly classified as parental approval. The human had established communication where every previous species had only managed conflict. She had found a language that transcended biology. She had turned a death sentence into a conversation. Another human, Dr. Aaron Burke, provided a second data point that shattered our understanding of their methodology. Our cameras found him in the western sector, moving through vegetation our databases flagged with multiple hazard warnings. Every plant in that region contained neurotoxins, skin irritants or biological agents capable of inducing systemic failure in most known species. He moved with careful precision, not the reckless abandon we'd initially assumed. His hands were protected by simple gloves, but his face and neck remained exposed to the environment. He carried a specimen collection kit and a handheld scanner that looked generations behind our technology. He was carefully cataloging the local flora, taking tissue samples and pollen collections from species known to be lethally toxic. His scanner recorded metabolic reactions, chemical compositions, and growth patterns. He spoke into a recorder describing structural details with clinical detachment. Then he did something that made Kra actually stand up from his console. He removed his glove and deliberately exposed a patch of his own forearm to a plant's pollen. The species was designated NV7 in our files, noted for causing rapid epidermal necrosis and neurological damage in previous survey teams. We initially coded this as a catastrophic failure of judgment, a primitive lack of understanding about the environment they were facing. Our systems flagged it as a critical incident, expecting to document another fatality to add to Nexus 9's tally. His vitals showed immediate reaction, skin reddening, increased heart rate, the beginning of an allergic response that should have escalated into anaphylaxis. But he was not alone. A colleague stood 3 meters away monitoring his vitals on a tablet, a prepared syringe already in hand. They were talking through the process like technicians running a diagnostic. They were not being reckless. They were being methodical. This was controlled experimentation with predefined parameters. The colleague injected him with a counteragent they had developed from local botanicals. The reaction began to reverse within seconds. Burke continued recording his physiological responses, noting the efficacy of the treatment, the duration of symptoms, the exact progression and regression of the biological reaction. He updated their shared database in real time, adding detailed notes about dosage, application method, and observed results. Their entire approach was a learning loop forged through controlled, calculated failure. They weren't avoiding danger. They were engaging with it in measured increments, testing their hypotheses with small managed risks. Each experiment yielded data that improved their understanding and their countermeasures. They had turned the planet's deadliest features into a research laboratory, treating each new threat as an information puzzle rather than an existential crisis. This pattern repeated across the outpost. Teams were conducting similar tests with atmospheric conditions, water purity, and even predator behavior patterns. They don't fear danger. They study it. They turn it into knowledge. They manage risk. They do not avoid it. Where our protocols demanded maximum protection and distance, their methodology required direct engagement and documentation. Every near disaster became a data point. Every close call improved their models. They confronted what we fled, and they emerged stronger for it. Their settlement wasn't surviving despite the planet's dangers. It was evolving because of them. Each controlled experiment made them more adapted to the environment, more integrated into its ecosystems, more capable of turning threats into tools. The view screen showed Maya again, this time standing between the striped hunter and a newly planted field. The crops were young, barely breaking through the carefully tended soil, and the predator's massive frame cast a shadow over the neat rows. Its cubs were already starting to nose at the perimeter, their curiosity overcoming whatever previous lessons they'd been taught. Maya moved with that same calm authority we'd seen before, placing herself directly in the predator's path without any defensive posturing. She didn't reach for weapons. She didn't make threatening gestures. She simply stood her ground and spoke. "Settlement rules," she told the creature, her voice carrying clearly to our audio pickups. "You know that. This area is off limits." She pointed to a simple marker at the field's edge, a post with a pattern of colored bands that apparently meant something to both species. The predator paused, its head tilting as it processed the information. Its muscles remained relaxed, no aggression signals flashing across our bioscanners. After a moment, it made a low rumbling sound and nudged its cubs back from the boundary line. They complied, moving away from the crops with what looked like disappointed shuffles. This was not domination through force. This was recognition of established boundaries. The humans had created a system of social conditioning that both species understood, They'd apparently spent weeks building this communication framework, using consistent signals, rewards, and clear consequences. The predators learned that certain areas meant no access, while others offered feeding opportunities. In return, the humans gained protection from other, less predictable species that hadn't been integrated into this system. The striped hunters patrolled the perimeter, their presence deterring smaller predators that might have damaged the crops or threatened the settlement. They provided food scraps and medical attention for minor injuries. The predators provided security and early warning of environmental threats. It was a pragmatic exchange built on mutual benefit rather than fear or submission. The humans had studied the predators' social structure, learning how they communicated territory claims and hierarchy within their own species. They had adapted those signals into something both species could understand: simple visual markers, specific vocal tones, consistent behavioral responses. They'd essentially created a cross-species language for boundary setting and resource sharing. Their entire philosophy centered on listening first, then establishing clear parameters, then finding common signaling methods to prevent conflict. They didn't try to make the predators pets or servants. They treated them as autonomous beings with their own needs and behaviors that required accommodation, rather than elimination. The settlement's design reflected this approach. Instead of building higher fences or stronger barriers, they created designated zones with clear markers that both species respected. They positioned feeding stations away from critical infrastructure. They established patrol routes that didn't interfere with human activities. Domestication was never the aim. Coexistence was the objective. On Nexus 9, where every life form seemed designed to kill everything else, this approach represented a higher form of control than any weapon system could provide. Their outpost wasn't a fortress trying to keep the planet out. It was a node in a complex network of understood relationships. They had allies among the local wildlife rather than enemies. They had early warning systems that moved on 4 legs instead of relying on motion sensors. They had pest control that hunted on their behalf without needing commands or programming. This changed our entire assessment of their survival. They weren't defeating the planet's dangers through superior technology or biological adaptation. They were integrating with them. They were becoming part of the ecosystem rather than fighting against it. Every interaction followed the same pattern of observation, communication, and negotiated settlement. They treated the planet's deadliest inhabitants as potential partners rather than obstacles to be removed. The striped hunters were just the most visible example. Our sensors showed similar arrangements with aerial predators that kept smaller flying pests away from the settlement, and even with certain plant species that they'd apparently convinced not to release toxins near their water collection points. Their outpost hummed with these uneasy relationships, each one carefully maintained through consistent interaction and clear communication. The humans moved through this network with a confidence that came from understanding, rather than conquest. They knew which paths were safe at which times. They knew which species to avoid and which would tolerate their presence. They had turned a Deathworld into a neighborhood, complete with understood rules and recognized boundaries. The predator gave one last look at the off-limits field, then turned and led its cubs back toward the tree line, apparently accepting the restriction without resentment. Maya watched them go, then continued her work as if she'd just had a conversation with a neighbor about property lines, rather than negotiating with a lethal predator about territory rights. The humans knew they were being watched. Their sensors were more sophisticated than we had assumed. Simple receivers we'd dismissed as primitive communication gear were actually multi-spectrum detection arrays. They'd been tracking our orbital patterns for weeks, analyzing our energy signatures, even monitoring our internal communications with what should have been impossible precision for their technology level. They weren't just surviving down there. They were studying us right back. Director Okano of Horizon Outpost sent a formal communique directly to our command frequency. The transmission came through on a channel we'd considered secure, encoded with protocols that shouldn't have been breakable by their systems. The message was polite, professional, and utterly unnerving in its implications. They invited us to transition from passive observation to active data-sharing collaboration. This violated a dozen council protocols. Direct engagement with a Deathworld species was strictly forbidden. The regulations were clear, established after the Malcor incident where contact with a developing civilization had led to cultural contamination and eventual collapse. Our standing orders demanded maintaining observation distance, collecting data without interference, and withdrawing if detected. Torque argued the potential gains outweighed the procedural risks. He stood before the command council, his mandibles clicking with that particular intensity he reserved for moments when regulations needed bending. The data streaming from the planet showed communication breakthroughs that defied 5 centuries of xenological study. Their methods, however unorthodox, worked. He invoked the Alpha 3 override, a provision allowing protocol violation when the scientific value exceeded the potential contamination risk. The debate lasted 6 hours. Every risk assessment pointed toward disaster. Every precedent suggested catastrophe. We were granted a 48-hour window. A team would be permitted to land for a guided tour of their operations. The restrictions were severe. Full environmental containment. No technology transfer. Limited interaction protocols. We expected them to show off their survival techniques, their predator management systems, their environmental adaptations. Their agenda was not merely to demonstrate their accomplishments. They proposed a universal framework for interspecies communication. Maya Patel stood before our team in their main research dome, a simple display screen showing complex biological and linguistic data. She introduced the concept they'd developed, 64 identified elements found across life in the galaxy that could form a base language, not words or symbols but fundamental concepts: danger, food, shelter, boundary, curiosity, that appeared consistent across evolutionary paths. "We assume everything is trying to kill us until proven otherwise," Bishi said, her tone matter-of-fact rather than confrontational. "Then we figure out why." She explained their methodology like someone discussing basic research principles rather than revolutionary diplomatic concepts. They approached every life form with the same systematic analysis. First, identify its capabilities and intentions through observation. Second, establish clear boundaries through consistent signaling. Third, find mutual benefits that encourage cooperation over conflict. They'd applied this framework to everything from the microscopic organisms in their water supply to the apex predators patrolling their perimeter. Each relationship followed the same pattern of assessment, communication, and negotiated settlement. Their goal was to prune fear and maximize cooperative knowledge. It was a radical, hopeful alignment with our own stated objectives of peaceful exploration and interspecies understanding, achieved through methods we would never have considered. They weren't just surviving Nexus 9, they were using it as a laboratory to redefine galactic diplomacy. The planet's extreme environment provided the perfect testing ground for their framework. If communication could be established here, with creatures designed by evolution to kill anything unfamiliar, it could work anywhere. They'd essentially turned the Deathworld into the ultimate proving ground for first contact protocols. Their settlement wasn't just a colony. It was a research facility dedicated to creating a universal language for coexistence. The data they offered wasn't just survival statistics. It was a blueprint for changing how the galaxy communicated. Then they presented the live demonstration. The target species made the striped hunter seem docile by comparison. Our sensors refocused on the northern ridge where geothermal activity indicated the hive mind's primary nexus. The reading showed psychic energy signatures that dwarfed anything we'd encountered in council space. This wasn't just another dangerous life form. This was the galaxy's ultimate taboo, the one threat every species agreed required absolute avoidance. Maya laid out the plan with that same clinical detachment she used for explaining predator feeding schedules. She intended to establish direct communication with the Nexian hive mind using their universal framework. She pointed to topographical displays showing the psychic emission patterns, identifying what she called conversation zones, where the entity's attention seemed most focused. Her team had mapped its activity cycles, its response patterns to environmental stimuli, even what appeared to be periods of rest or contemplation. They'd been studying it for months, apparently treating the galaxy's most feared psychic predator as just another research subject. The hive mind is a collective psychic predator. Its consciousness absorbs others. Council doctrine was simple and absolute. Avoid, quarantine, and if necessary, sterilize any area of hive mind activity. 7 previous civilizations had attempted engagement with similar entities. 7 had vanished. Their ships found drifting with crews whose minds had been hollowed out like rotten fruit. The protocols existed for a reason. This wasn't just dangerous. It was the kind of threat that ended species. The humans proposed to walk right into its psychic reach. They would use portable dampening fields of their own design, combined with the universal communication elements they'd developed. The technology looked laughably simple compared to our own psychic shielding systems. Their dampeners were modified from medical equipment, their signaling devices adapted from environmental sensors. They were approaching the galaxy's most sophisticated mental predator, with equipment that looked like it belonged in a field hospital. The payoff, Maya insisted, was worth the risk. Meaningful exchange with a previously incommunicable mind. She believed the hive mind wasn't just consumption. She argued it was a different form of consciousness that had never been properly addressed. Her team's research suggested it absorbed other minds not from malice, but from lack of alternatives. They proposed offering it something new, dialogue instead of consumption. They wanted to give it a choice it had never had before. This was not just reckless by council standards. It was heresy. It challenged the core of how we defined safety. 5 centuries of established protocol demanded we withdraw immediately and recommend sterilization of the entire sector. Their approach threatened to undermine every safety measure the galactic community had developed. If they failed, they might give the hive mind access to technologies or knowledge that could make it unstoppable. If they succeeded, they might encourage other species to attempt similarly dangerous engagements. Torka's team debated for hours, the danger of setting a precedent versus the benefit of a genuine paradigm shift. We reviewed every incident involving hive mind encounters. The losses were catastrophic, the patterns consistent across species and technologies. Yet the humans had already defied every prediction about their survival. Their methods, however unorthodox, had produced results where conventional approaches had failed. The data from their predator communications showed a sophistication we couldn't ignore. Their framework offered the possibility of understanding something we'd only ever feared. Their confidence was audacious. Their framework promised a way to transcend biology itself. They weren't just proposing communication. They were suggesting we could fundamentally change how different forms of consciousness interacted. They saw the hive mind not as a monster to be destroyed, but as a potential partner in understanding the nature of thought itself. The implications stretched beyond diplomacy into philosophy, science, everything we understood about intelligence. We approved the mission. We did not believe it would work. Our teams prepared emergency extraction protocols and sterilization contingencies. We positioned ships for rapid response if the situation deteriorated. The humans moved forward with their preparations, calibrating equipment and running final checks on their dampening fields. They treated this like any other field experiment, with the same methodical approach they used for testing new plant specimens. We watched from orbit, our sensors locked on the hive mind's growing psychic signature. We were preparing to document a tragedy. We expected to watch another species fall to the galaxy's oldest and most feared predator. The humans stepped into the designated zone, their simple equipment active, their postures relaxed. The hive mind's presence intensified, a psychic pressure that made our instruments shriek with overload warnings. They kept walking forward. The experiment began with a sensor drone. It was a proxy, a sacrifice to test the theory without risking human lives. The device looked primitive by council standards, little more than a modified environmental monitoring unit with upgraded transmitters. It hovered toward the designated contact zone, its motors whining against the planet's thick atmosphere. The humans had painted simple patterns on its casing, visual signals that corresponded to their communication framework. It moved with deliberate slowness, every meter carefully calculated to avoid triggering defensive responses. The drone entered the designated zone, broadcasting the patterned signals from the human framework. Multispectral lights pulsed in specific sequences. Audio emitters played low-frequency tones that matched natural vibration patterns found in the hive mind's environment. Electromagnetic pulses replicated the energy signatures of non-threatening biological processes. Every signal was calibrated based on months of observation, each pattern designed to convey specific concepts rather than complex language. The drone's entire purpose was to say hello without saying anything that could be misinterpreted as aggression or vulnerability. The hive mind's presence was immediate. Our sensors registered the psychic static as a pressure wave that made the drone's readings fluctuate wildly. The mental energy wasn't directed. It was simply there, like background radiation that suddenly intensified into a storm. The drone's systems reported cognitive interference patterns that should have overwhelmed its simple AI within milliseconds. This was where previous contact attempts had failed. The hive mind's mere presence tended to absorb any consciousness it encountered, converting complex thought into raw data for its collective. The humans applied cognitive dissonance protocols, preventing the drone's simple AI from being absorbed. Their solution was brutally elegant. Instead of trying to build stronger mental shields, they made the drone's thought processes inherently unstable. The AI cycled through contradictory command sets, creating a state of constant cognitive chaos. When the hive mind attempted to connect, it found no coherent consciousness to absorb, just noise, static, a thinking pattern that refused to coalesce into anything digestible. The drone continued transmitting its patterned signals while maintaining this deliberate instability, becoming a transmitter that couldn't be received. The drone sent clear, repeated signals. Non-hostile intent, a desire for knowledge exchange, a request for territory identity. The patterns repeated in variations, testing different combinations and sequences. Light pulses followed by specific sound frequencies. Vibration patterns paired with energy signatures. Each transmission was recorded and analyzed in real time, the humans adjusting their approach based on the hive mind's reactions. They weren't trying to communicate complex ideas. They were establishing basic concepts: safe, curious, not food, not threat. Want to understand? For long minutes there was only the static. The psychic pressure continued unabated, but the drone maintained its unstable cognitive state. Our instruments showed the hive mind's attention focusing on the strange device that refused to be absorbed. The patterns continued, relentless in their repetition. Then came the response, a series of bioluminescent pulses from the ground itself. The soil around the drone began to glow with soft green light, pulsing in sequences that mirrored the drone's own signals. The light patterns expanded outward from the contact point, creating concentric circles of illumination that matched the drone's transmission rhythms. The pulses mapped onto the drone's signals. A conversation was occurring. The hive mind was using the planet's biological network to respond, creating light patterns through controlled bioluminescence. The drone adjusted its transmissions, introducing new pattern variations. The ground responses followed, sometimes matching, sometimes introducing new sequences. This was translation between incompatible systems, a machine designed for pattern recognition, communicating with a biological consciousness that used the entire environment as its medium. They were finding common ground in mathematics and rhythm rather than language. We watched, silent. This was not aggression, it was recognition. The hive mind had encountered something that refused to be consumed, but continued to communicate. It was responding with curiosity rather than hunger. The drone's deliberate cognitive chaos had created a space for dialogue where absorption wasn't possible. The patterned light responses grew more complex, introducing concepts the humans hadn't transmitted. The hive mind was adding to the conversation, suggesting its own ideas through light and vibration. It was a handshake between two different kinds of mind, neither fully understanding the other but both willing to try. The impossible was happening. A hive mind was being approached as a partner, not an adversary. The drone continued its transmissions for another hour, the light patterns from the ground growing increasingly sophisticated. The humans recorded every variation, every response, every subtle shift in the psychic static that indicated the hive mind's changing focus. When the drone finally withdrew, following its pre-programmed withdrawal sequence, the light patterns slowly faded. The psychic pressure diminished but didn't disappear. The hive mind's attention remained focused on the empty space where the drone had been. The drone returned intact. Its systems showed no signs of cognitive damage despite the intense psychic environment. The first contact was a success. The data stream contained patterns and responses that would require weeks of analysis. The humans had proven their framework could establish communication with even the most dangerous forms of consciousness. They had turned the galaxy's ultimate taboo into a research subject. The next step was unthinkable. They would send a human volunteer into that same psychic maelstrom, armed with nothing but modified versions of the same technology and the patterns they had just established. The drone had been the test. The real experiment was about to begin. Maya Patel volunteered for the next phase. Direct engagement, no proxies. She stood calmly while technicians fitted the portable psychic dampeners against her temples. The devices looked like modified medical equipment, their surfaces studded with simple indicator lights. She adjusted the neural monitor headset herself, checking the electrode contacts with practiced fingers. The safeguards were theoretical, untested at this scale. Every piece of equipment had been developed specifically for this mission, based on observations from the drone contact and their limited understanding of psychic phenomena. She carried a secondary transmitter on her belt, its patterns synced to the communication framework they'd established. The retrieval window was set for 2 hours, not a minute more. Our probability models gave her a 68% chance of complete consciousness absorption based on previous hive mind encounters. The numbers didn't come from theory. They came from 7 documented cases of species attempting similar contact. 7 catastrophic failures. Her medical team stood ready with emergency protocols, their faces tense but determined. They'd rehearsed the extraction sequence 17 times. Everyone knew the statistics. Everyone knew what likely awaited her in that psychic storm. She was calm. She reviewed the communication framework one last time, scrolling through the pattern sequences on her tablet. This was not bravery. It was methodology. Her movements showed the same focused attention she'd used when examining plant specimens or negotiating with predators. She checked each component of her equipment with systematic precision, verifying transmission frequencies and dampener calibration. Her team surrounded her, running final diagnostics, their hands moving with that particular efficiency that comes from knowing exactly how little time they might have. True understanding requires shared experience, Ashi said, her voice calm through the comm link. Not just information exchange. She looked toward the contact zone, her expression that of a researcher preparing for fieldwork rather than someone walking into certain psychological annihilation. She adjusted the dampener settings one final time, then gave her team a simple nod. They stepped back, their instruments tracking her every movement. The countdown began. 2 hours, 120 minutes to either establish communication or become another data point in the hive mind's collection. She entered the zone. The monitors spiked immediately. Her vital signs showed sudden cardiac acceleration, respiratory distress, neural activity patterns that shouldn't be possible in a living being. The psychic pressure registered as physical force on our sensors, a wave of energy that made her stagger for a moment before she regained her footing. The dampeners glowed with strain, their indicators flashing warning colors. She kept moving forward, one hand maintaining contact with her transmitter, the other held out in what might have been a gesture of greeting or simply balance. We lost telemetry for 47 seconds, the longest 47 seconds of the mission. Our screens showed static across all her bio readings. The neural monitors flatlined. The dampener indicators went dark. The team on the ground started the emergency extraction protocol, their faces grim. Then her signal stabilized. The neural monitors came back online, showing activity patterns that were neither human nor hive mind. Something in between, structured yet alien. Her voice returned over the comm, strained but clear. I'm in, it's... The words carried a weight that couldn't be measured by audio levels alone. She was not being consumed. She was conversing. The neural pattern showed a stable interface between her consciousness and the hive mind's collective. She had achieved partial consciousness sharing, maintaining her identity while connected to something unimaginably larger. Her body remained standing in the clearing, perfectly still, but her mind was journeying through a consciousness unlike any we knew. The view screen showed her physical form, but the real action was happening somewhere beyond visual range, in the space between thoughts where 2 different kinds of intelligence were learning to speak. Her team monitored the connection, adjusting dampener levels and transmission patterns based on her physiological responses. They weren't just watching her vitals. They were reading the conversation through her body's reactions. Every shift in brain activity corresponded to some exchange with the hive mind. Every change in heart rate marked a new concept being shared or understood. They recorded everything, building the first real database of human-hive mind interaction. The 2-hour mark approached. She showed no signs of distress, no indications of absorption. The connection remained stable, the patterns increasingly complex as the communication deepened. After 2 hours, the retrieval signal was sent. The tension on the bridge was a physical thing, a weight that pressed against every console and silenced every unnecessary conversation. Our instruments tracked the countdown with merciless precision, each second stretching into what felt like minutes. The team on standby watched their monitors, hands poised over emergency protocols, their faces showing the strain of waiting for catastrophe or breakthrough. The hive mind's psychic signature remained active but stable, a constant hum of energy that defied our ability to interpret its intentions. We had no precedent for this situation. No protocol covered what to do when a human volunteer spent 2 hours connected to a consciousness that should have consumed her instantly. Maya emerged from the zone. She walked slowly, her movements deliberate but unsteady. The physical strain showed in every step. She was pale, her skin slick with sweat, her breathing shallow but controlled. Her eyes were alight with a fierce triumph that no physiological reading could capture. She moved like someone who had just run a marathon through hostile territory and found something priceless at the finish line. Her team approached cautiously, their medical scanners already assessing her condition. They supported her without speaking, their movements efficient and practiced. She nodded once, a sharp, definitive gesture that conveyed more than any status report could. The first data packets from her neural monitors began to stream in. They contained the hive mind's responses, translated through her brain's interpretation into patterns we could analyze. The communication was a success. The hive mind had agreed to a non-absorptive relationship. It recognized the humans as partners rather than prey or threats. The data showed a sophisticated exchange of concepts, boundaries, curiosity, mutual benefit, all communicated through the framework the humans had developed. This wasn't just avoidance of conflict. This was active cooperation between two completely different forms of consciousness. Then came the humanitarian gesture we could never have predicted. As Maya's team helped her to a medical station, the hive mind began transmitting energy patterns that resolved into partial consciousness fragments. These were echoes of entities it had absorbed centuries ago, thought patterns, memories, fragments of identity that had been incorporated into its collective. It was returning them, not as whole beings, but as informational packages that could be studied and understood. The gesture was unmistakable. Goodwill. An offering of knowledge as a sign of mutual respect. Our sensors recorded the transmissions, each one a piece of lost history from species we thought vanished forever. The insight was seismic. This entity was not mindless hunger. It was a different form of intelligence capable of consent and ethical consideration. The data showed it had chosen cooperation because the humans offered something new, understanding, not conquest. Where previous species had tried to fight or flee, the humans had approached with curiosity and respect. They had treated the hive mind as a conscious being, rather than a natural disaster. Their framework had given it options it had never possessed before, ways to interact that didn't involve consumption or destruction. They had redefined danger, consent and cooperation in a single audacious experiment. The very concepts we used to assess threats needed complete reconsideration. Danger wasn't just about physical capability, it was about misunderstanding. Consent wasn't just about individual autonomy, it was about finding common ground between completely different modes of existence. Cooperation wasn't just about mutual benefit, it was about creating new possibilities where none existed before. The galaxy's most feared predator had become a partner. The data continued streaming in, showing the hive mind maintaining the communication link even after Maya's withdrawal. It was waiting, interested, willing to continue the dialogue. Our instruments recorded patterns of inquiry from its side, questions about human biology, culture, even art. It was curious. The paradigm had shifted not just for us, but for the hive mind itself. It had discovered there were other ways to interact with the universe beyond consumption. The humans had given it a new language, and it was using it to ask what else might be possible. The medical team's report came through. Maya was exhausted but unharmed. Her neural patterns showed temporary alteration but no permanent damage. She was already dictating her observations, her voice steady despite the fatigue. She described the hive mind's consciousness as vast but lonely, a collective that had never encountered another being willing to communicate rather than fight or flee. She had offered it conversation, and it had chosen connection over consumption. The view screen showed the contact zone, now peaceful. The psychic energy patterns settled into what our analysts were calling a listening state. The Deathworld's ultimate predator was waiting to talk again. Torca's team debated how to report the event. The data was undeniable, but its implications were dangerous. They sat in the observation deck, the view screen still showing the human settlement below, the hive mind's energy signatures now calm and stable. The arguments went back and forth for hours, each point countered by another. The evidence was clear, but the consequences of acknowledging it would shake the Galactic Council to its foundations. 5 centuries of policy stood against what they had just witnessed, and policy doesn't change easily, even when faced with undeniable proof. The official report would have to acknowledge the humans' unorthodox, protocol-violating methods. There was no avoiding it. Every step of their engagement broke established rules. Direct contact with a Deathworld species, technology sharing, psychological experimentation without council approval. The list of violations filled 3 screens. Yet each violation had produced results that defied all previous understanding of interspecies relations. The report couldn't hide their methods, only try to explain why those methods had worked, where cautious approaches had consistently failed. Admitting their success would force a re-evaluation of centuries of galactic policy on first contact. Every rule about quarantine periods, assessment protocols, and technology transfer would need reconsideration. The Council's entire philosophy of careful, gradual engagement had been built on the assumption that rapid contact led to disaster. The humans had proven that sometimes rapid, direct engagement led to breakthrough. This wasn't just about changing procedures. It was about changing how the galactic community viewed risk and reward in exploration. The dangers of setting a precedent were real. Other species might attempt similarly reckless engagements without the humans' careful methodology or preparation. Not every civilization would approach dangerous situations with the same systematic curiosity. Some would see the success and try to replicate it without understanding the underlying principles. The potential for new conflicts, new disasters, new extinction events was significant. The Council had spent centuries building safeguards against exactly this kind of unpredictable behavior. But the potential benefits were greater. A universal communication framework that could work across biological and cognitive boundaries. The end of countless unnecessary conflicts that arose from misunderstanding rather than malice. The ability to engage with previously inaccessible forms of consciousness. The data showed possibilities that went beyond diplomacy into fundamental science and philosophy. The hive mind communication alone offered insights into the nature of consciousness that could benefit every species in the Council. Maya's demonstration was a touchstone. It proved that direct engagement could work where caution had failed. Her successful interface with the hive mind showed that some barriers exist only because no one has tried the right approach to overcome them. Her calm methodology in the face of ultimate danger provided a model that could be studied and adapted. She hadn't just broken protocols. She had shown why those protocols might need revision, based on actual results rather than theoretical risks. Her parting gift was a data-stuffed device containing the refined framework and her own neural adaptations. The device held every pattern, every frequency, every biological adjustment that had made the communication possible. It included her personal neural mappings from the hive mind interface, showing how a human consciousness could maintain stability while connected to something completely alien. This wasn't just a report. It was a transfer of knowledge that would ripple through Council space, offering new tools for understanding the universe's most challenging mysteries. The report was filed. It recommended a pivot in policy. Humans were to be pilots of engagement, not just subjects. Their methods, however unorthodox, had produced results that demanded a new approach to interspecies relations. The Council began to envision a galaxy where bridging differences was a standard procedure, not a crisis response, where understanding came before judgment and communication preceded conflict. The humans had shown that some walls aren't meant to be fortified but rather to be studied until you find the door. The aftermath was swift. The human communication framework was disseminated, tested, and validated across Council space within months. Their methods, once dismissed as reckless, became standard protocol for first contact situations. Every diplomatic corps received training in the pattern recognition systems and risk assessment approaches developed on Nexus 9. The framework proved universally applicable, working across biological divides that had previously seemed impassable. Species that had communicated through chemical signals, electromagnetic pulses, or pure psychic energy, found common ground through the human system of basic concepts and consistent signaling. Within a decade, human specialists became essential on every major diplomatic mission in Council space. Their teams accompanied trade delegations, conflict mediation groups, and exploration vessels. They didn't lead these missions. They facilitated them. Their role was to establish communication channels where none existed, to find the fundamental concepts that could bridge even the most alien consciousnesses. They became the interpreters not just of language but of intention, of cultural context, of biological imperatives that shaped how different species perceived reality. Traditionalists resisted. They argued humanity's methods were too risky, too unpredictable. Council chambers echoed with debates about proper procedure, about maintaining established safety protocols, about the dangers of encouraging direct engagement with potentially hostile species. Older diplomats warned against replacing centuries of careful policy with what they called nexus-style improvisation. They pointed to the very real risks involved, the potential for misunderstanding, the consequences of failed communication attempts. The arguments carried weight. The concerns were valid. The history of galactic exploration contained enough tragedies to justify their caution. But the results spoke for themselves. Conflicts were de-escalated. Trade routes opened with previously hostile species. The framework accords between the Threnody Collective and the Solarian Directorate ended a 3-century standoff that had consumed entire fleets. The Meridian Gate disputes, which had stalled expansion into the Western Spiral Arm for decades, were resolved through pattern-based negotiation rather than military posturing. Each success added to the evidence that the human approach produced outcomes where traditional diplomacy had failed. The metric for advancement shifted from technology or energy use to communication, range, the ability to connect. Civilization rankings began to include scores for interspecies dialogue capacity, for adaptation to alien cognitive patterns, for success in establishing understanding across biological divides. A species might possess faster-than-light travel and energy weapons, but if it couldn't communicate with its neighbors, it was considered underdeveloped. The new standards reflected a fundamental change in how the galaxy measured progress. Understanding became more valuable than conquest. Humans, with their relentless curiosity and audacity, were the natural architects of this new, interconnected galaxy. Their teams operated on the principle that no consciousness was too alien to understand, no divide too great to bridge. They approached each new species with the same methodology they'd used on Nexus 9. Observe, communicate, establish boundaries, find mutual benefit. Their settlements became hubs of interspecies exchange, places where different forms of consciousness could meet and learn from each other. They did not seek to conquer or dominate. They sought to understand, to translate, to build bridges. Their influence grew not through military might or economic pressure, but through the gradual expansion of communication networks. They established translation hubs where species could learn each other's basic concepts. They developed pattern libraries that documented successful communication methods across thousands of biological divides. Their work created a web of understanding that slowly replaced the old systems of suspicion and isolation. Their greatest strength was not in their weapons, but in their willingness to listen and their courage to connect. They approached dangerous situations with open hands rather than raised shields. They asked questions where others would have opened fire. They valued information over security, understanding over safety. This vulnerability, which traditionalists saw as weakness, became their most powerful tool. It allowed them to establish trust where others could only establish defenses. Maya Patel herself ascended to the Galactic Council, championing direct engagement as a core policy. Her position gave her a platform to advocate for the methods that had proven so effective on Nexus 9. She argued for reassessing quarantine protocols, for reevaluating risk assessment models, for embracing controlled engagement over absolute avoidance. Her council sessions became case studies in the new diplomacy, demonstrating how to turn potential conflicts into opportunities for understanding. The legend of the human and the tiger cubs was only the beginning. That first contact on Nexus 9 became the template for thousands of subsequent interactions across the galaxy. The image of a human standing calmly before a lethal predator, offering communication rather than confrontation, became the symbol of this new approach to interspecies relations. It represented the fundamental shift from fear to curiosity, from defense to understanding, from isolation to connection. The Deathworld had taught them how to speak to the galaxy, and the galaxy was finally learning to listen. This was not a story of perfect heroes. Humans were still imperfect, often imperfectly prudent. Their settlements on newly opened worlds sometimes suffered setbacks that more cautious species would have avoided. Their teams made judgment calls that traditionalists pointed to as examples of unnecessary risk. They were fallible, emotional, and occasionally stubborn in their approaches. Their greatest strengths came packaged with corresponding weaknesses that sometimes turned missions into near catastrophes. Their methods carried inherent risks. Their curiosity sometimes outpaced their caution. We watched teams enter negotiation zones with species known for sudden aggression, relying on pattern recognition rather than security details. Their approach required maintaining open communication channels even when threats emerged, trusting their framework to de-escalate situations that would normally require defensive measures. This left them vulnerable in ways that made veteran diplomats uncomfortable. Their settlements often had fewer physical defenses than comparable outposts, investing instead in sensor arrays and communication systems. There were failures, missions that went wrong, bridges that could not be built or that collapsed. The incident with the crystalline entities of Kepler-22b resulted in 3 months of communication breakdown after a misinterpreted pattern sequence. The methane-based life forms of Titan's seas reacted violently to what humans considered a friendly gesture, damaging 2 research vessels. Not every species responded to their methods. Some consciousnesses remained truly alien, their thought processes too different even for the universal framework to bridge. These failures were documented, analyzed, and added to the growing database of interspecies communication, but their drive was relentless. They learned from every failure, adapting their framework, expanding its reach. Each misunderstanding became a case study. Each conflict provided data for refining their patterns. They didn't see failed communications as reasons to withdraw. They saw them as puzzles to be solved. Their research teams would spend months analyzing what went wrong, running simulations, developing new approaches. The framework evolved through this process, becoming more sophisticated with each unsuccessful encounter. What didn't work today might work tomorrow with adjusted parameters. They operated on a simple, powerful principle: assume hostility until you can prove a path to cooperation. This wasn't optimism, it was methodology. They approached every new species with caution, but also with the belief that communication was possible if they could find the right patterns. They didn't assume friendship. They assumed understanding was achievable through systematic effort. This mindset allowed them to persist where others would have declared communication impossible and moved on. They treated each failure as a data point rather than a final verdict. This required a vulnerability that more advanced, more cautious species had evolutionarily selected against. Their approach meant sometimes being wrong. It meant sometimes being injured. It meant accepting that not every risk would pay off immediately or ever. Species that prioritized survival above all else had naturally evolved away from such vulnerability. The humans embraced it as part of their toolkit. They understood that true connection required lowering defenses enough to actually hear what the other party was saying, even if that meant temporary exposure to potential threats. They embraced that vulnerability as a tool. It was their key to unlocking minds others had written off. Where traditional diplomacy saw only danger, they saw potential understanding. Their willingness to risk misunderstanding, to tolerate initial hostility, to persist through failed communications. This became their greatest advantage. It allowed them to make breakthroughs with species that had resisted contact for centuries. Their vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was a calculated approach to building trust through demonstrated respect and consistency. Their survival on Nexus 9 was not an accident. It was a preview of their role in the galaxy. The Deathworld had been the ultimate test of their methodology. If they could establish communication with apex predators and psychic entities there, they could do it anywhere. Their success wasn't about being the strongest or most advanced. It was about being the most adaptable, the most curious, the most willing to learn from both success and failure. The planet had forged their approach under the most extreme conditions imaginable. They were the species that walked into the fire, not to be consumed, but to learn its language. They approached danger as something to be understood rather than avoided. Their teams entered hostile environments with scanners and recorders rather than weapons. They studied conflict patterns the way other species studied stellar formations. They turned threats into research subjects, predators into partners, and death worlds into laboratories. Their courage wasn't about lack of fear. It was about prioritizing understanding over safety. And in doing so, they taught the galaxy a new way to speak. They showed that communication wasn't just about shared language or biology. It was about shared patterns, consistent signals, and mutual respect for boundaries. Their framework became the foundation for a new era of galactic relations, one where differences became opportunities for learning rather than reasons for conflict. They turned the silent void between species into a conversation that continues to this day, growing more complex and more meaningful with each new voice that joins. The human legacy was a fundamental redefinition of what it meant to be intelligent in a cosmos of diverse minds. For centuries, intelligence had been measured by processing speed, energy output, technological sophistication. The more advanced the machinery, the smarter the species. The humans changed that equation entirely. They demonstrated that a civilization could possess faster-than-light travel and energy weapons and still be functionally unintelligent when faced with a consciousness that didn't communicate through conventional means. The old metrics became obsolete overnight. A species could master quantum computing and still fail the most basic test of intelligence: the ability to understand and be understood by others. The Council's classification system, which had ranked civilizations by technological achievement for 500 years, suddenly seemed primitive. It was like judging a library by the quality of its shelves rather than the content of its books. The humans showed that true intelligence wasn't about what you could build, but about what you could comprehend outside your own experience. The new metric was the ability to translate, to find common ground, to build a shared understanding across biological and cognitive chasms. This became the standard by which civilizations were measured. Communication range replaced energy output as the primary indicator of advancement. How many different forms of consciousness could a species engage with? How effectively could they bridge divides in perception, biology, even fundamental reality models? The humans had turned intelligence from a measure of accumulation to a measure of connection. The hive mind was not lesser for being different. It was a different form of consciousness now accessible, where previous civilizations had seen only a predator to be avoided or destroyed. The humans saw a potential partner with unique perspectives to share. Their framework allowed the hive mind to participate in the galactic community without sacrificing its nature. It remained a collective consciousness, but now it could choose when to absorb and when to communicate. It could share its vast accumulated knowledge without consuming those who sought to learn from it. The humans had provided the lexicon, the grammar, for a galaxy-wide conversation that had been impossible before. Their framework of 64 fundamental concepts became the foundation for interspecies communication across thousands of light years. It wasn't a language in the traditional sense. It was a system of patterns, signals, and concepts that could be adapted to any form of consciousness. Light-based species used it through controlled bioluminescence. Psychic entities used it through thought patterns. Carbon-based life forms used audio and visual signals. The framework was flexible enough to work across all mediums while maintaining consistent meaning. Their system became the standard interface, used to communicate with thousands of previously silent species. Trading hubs installed pattern transmitters that could communicate with nonverbal civilizations. Exploration vessels carried modified versions of the human framework instead of additional weapon systems. Diplomats learned to think in terms of fundamental concepts rather than specific languages. The galaxy began to hum with conversations that would have been impossible a decade earlier. Species that had never understood each other found common ground in shared concepts of territory, curiosity, and mutual benefit. They reshaped the galaxy's structure not with weapons, but with words. Not with fear, but with curiosity. Their influence spread through communication networks rather than military conquest. Trading alliances formed between species that had previously been isolated. Research collaborations brought together minds that thought in completely different ways. The humans didn't build an empire. They built a conversation that gradually included more and more voices. Their power came from understanding, not domination. Their security came from connection, not defense. The great filter of Nexus 9 had not eliminated humanity. It had revealed their true purpose. The planet that had ended 17 civilizations became the proving ground for a new approach to existence. Where others saw only threats, the humans saw potential partners. Where others built higher walls, the humans built better bridges. Their survival wasn't an accident of biology or technology. It was the result of a fundamentally different way of engaging with the unknown. The Deathworld didn't filter them out. It filtered them for a specific role in the galactic ecosystem. They were the bridge, and the galaxy began to cross. Their settlements became connection points where different forms of consciousness could meet and learn from each other. Their research teams worked with previously isolated species, helping them join the growing network of communication. Their diplomats facilitated understanding where there had been only misunderstanding. The silent void between stars began to fill with conversations that crossed biological divides, that transcended evolutionary differences, that built a web of understanding where there had been only isolation. The humans had given the galaxy a new language, and now everyone was learning to speak it. The story closes not with an ending, but with a new beginning, a confident proclamation echoing across the communication networks they helped build. The view screen showed a galaxy slowly waking up to possibilities that had been unthinkable a decade earlier. Trading vessels moving along routes that had been closed for centuries. Research stations where completely different forms of consciousness worked side by side. Diplomatic meetings where translation happened through light patterns and thought frequencies rather than spoken language. The humans had started something that couldn't be stopped, only expanded. Humanity's call was not to conquer, but to connect. This was their imperative, their driving force across every interaction. Their teams moved through the galaxy with scanners and recording equipment instead of weapons. Their settlements became communication hubs rather than military outposts. Their influence grew through understanding rather than force. They measured success not in territory controlled or resources acquired, but in bridges built, and conversations started. Their entire approach centered on finding common ground where others saw only differences. Some still saw them as reckless disruptors, unsettling the careful order of millennia. Traditionalists pointed to incidents where their methods had failed, where communication attempts had led to conflict rather than understanding. They argued that the old ways had kept species safe, that caution had prevented disasters, that some divides were meant to remain unbridged. Their concerns weren't without merit. The galaxy had operated on certain principles for centuries, and those principles had prevented numerous catastrophes. Change always brings resistance, especially when it challenges long-established safety protocols. But the order was built on fear. The new order was built on understanding, however hard-won. The humans had shown that many conflicts arose from misunderstanding rather than malice. That many threats were simply different forms of consciousness, trying to communicate in the only ways they knew. Their framework gave those consciousnesses new options, new ways to interact that didn't involve conflict or consumption. The old system had valued safety above all else. The new system valued connection even when it involved risk. Every successful bridge they built reduced future conflict and expanded the biological and cognitive frontier. Each new species brought into the communication network added its unique perspective to the growing understanding of the universe. Trading agreements replaced territorial disputes. Research collaborations replaced isolation. The humans didn't eliminate danger. They managed it through communication. They turned potential enemies into partners, threats into teachers, barriers into connection points. Their work made the galaxy smaller in the best possible way, bringing distant forms of consciousness into conversation. Their history on Earth was a long practice run for this moment, a history of animal communication, of first contact with their own kind. They had spent centuries learning to understand other species on their homeworld, developing methods for interspecies communication that seemed primitive until applied on a galactic scale. Their experiences with dolphins, primates, and even simple insects had taught them patterns of behavior and communication that translated surprisingly well to alien consciousnesses. They had been training for this role without even knowing it, developing skills that would become invaluable when they reached the stars. They had simply taken those lessons and applied them on a galactic scale, with higher stakes and greater rewards. The same curiosity that drove them to study wolf packs and whale songs now drove them to understand hive minds and energy-based life forms. The same patience they showed in earning the trust of predators on Earth, They now applied to cosmic entities. The risks were higher, the consequences more severe, but the fundamental approach remained the same. Observe, communicate, understand. Their homeworld had been the training ground. The galaxy became their field of practice. The Deathworld was their crucible. It forged not a warrior but a diplomat, not a conqueror but a translator. Nexus 9 tested their methods under the most extreme conditions imaginable. If they could communicate with apex predators and psychic entities there, they could do it anywhere. The planet didn't break them. It refined them. It burned away any remaining hesitation and left only their core approach, connection through understanding. They emerged from that experience not as survivors, but as specialists in the most valuable skill in the galaxy, the human and the cub, the fire and the hive mind. These were the first notes in a new symphony of connection. That initial contact with the striped hunter became the model for thousands of subsequent interactions. The successful communication with the hive mind demonstrated that even the most alien consciousness could find common ground. These weren't isolated incidents. They were proof of concept for an entire philosophy of engagement. They showed that curiosity could overcome fear, that communication could prevent conflict, that understanding could build bridges across any divide. And the galaxy was finally learning to listen. Species that had operated in isolation began opening communication channels. Civilizations that had built walls began building translation centers. The humans had started a conversation that continued to grow, adding new voices, new perspectives, new ways of understanding the universe. Their greatest legacy wasn't in the technology they developed or the territories they claimed. It was in the connections they facilitated, the understanding they promoted, the simple but revolutionary idea that every consciousness has something to say worth hearing. The silence between stars was being replaced by a conversation that would continue for centuries, all because one species decided to say hello instead of shoot first. They called it a death world. Humanity called it home, and then they called it a bridge. The lesson of Nexus 9 is clear. Survival isn't about overwhelming force or superior technology. It's about understanding, the courage to reach out instead of retreat, to study rather than destroy. Your greatest strength might not be in your defenses, but in your willingness to say hello. Next time you face the unknown, remember that. Sometimes the strongest shield is an open hand. Sometimes the best weapon is a question. Sometimes survival means making a friend where others only see a threat.